Hi everyone. So for this cast, I would like to talk to you all about sex. Yes, sex. Particularly gay sex, which of course is something that we often just kind of brush aside as a society because, of course, we can have the gay characters, but of course, if they engage in sodomy, well, let's just castrate all of them. However, I don't really care to castrate any of that, and I would actually prefer to, so to speak, just let it all out. So basically, we talk about the ideas of proper sex and improper sex and what that kind of looks like. Well, we look at biblical influence, and of course, that's where we start with this Leviticus 18 22 verse. This is what kind of outlines the idea of homosexuality being sinful, as a man shall not lie with another man as he does a woman, as it is an abomination. Well, it's one of those things that we kind of can debate on a biblical proportion, but of course that's not the point of this cast. Not only does Leviticus list a lot of sex rules as a result of homosexuality, but it also talks about how sex is not supposed to be performed unless it is to produce a child. In fact, there are many Hasidic Jews who do perform sex through a sheet. They'll have a hole in the sheet in which male genitals will go through, as men are not actually supposed to receive any sexual pleasure, which I find to be most interesting just because when you look at how society structures sex, it's mostly the idea that men are the only ones that are horny, whereas women, of course, are complete and total prudes. But, of course, this is not my Sex and the City class, and I have my own midterm for that. Um, but I'd kind of like to talk about, instead of just the biblical idea of what sex is supposed to be, let's talk about the modern day idea of what sex is supposed to be. Strangely enough, of course, the biblical ideas are still influencing that of modern day. We see sodomy laws and the idea of, being more traditional when it comes to practices. Of course, we know in these later years when it comes to same-sex marriage being legalized, this idea of sodomy laws and this idea of, improper marriage and just all of this stuff. And I think really what it comes down to is the idea of people not being comfortable with gay sex. And it's something that, I've seen many YouTube videos of people talking about what they think gay sex is. And a lot of people don't even realize what gay sex is, which I think is most interesting because it's not hard to figure out. But it's strange because we live in a society that really does favor the idea of sex being very, very open. Of course, we look at from the 1960s on this idea of sex selling, this idea that sex should not be something that we fear, but it's something that should be open and something that causes so many positive emotions, and therefore we live in a very sex-driven society. We look at what it's like to have sex as a gay man now. I know that I can speak from experience when it comes to the social apps. Of course, we have Grindr, we have Scruff, we have Adam for Adam, we have Jacked, we have God, we have so much. Mister, Lavender, Tinder. We still use that too. We have J Swipe, which is kind of fun for us Jews. But anyways, we have all these apps. So literally, I can go on my phone. I mean, I used to be able to go on my phone before I got locked down with a boyfriend, but I could go on any of these apps, click on some guy that I thought was hot, and say DTF, and show him a picture of my dick, and that'd be pretty much it. And that's something that's so free in access. Well, we also have to look at it's on a phone, and therefore it's not as open as, say, the sex that we'll see on TV. Of course, it's becoming a little bit more public with shows like How to Get Away with Murder and things of that nature that kind of do show that, yes, gay people do have sex too. But As it kind of correlates with the curriculum, we look at Chris Bell's narrative on how he is not the man he used to be, this idea of HIV stigma. And of course, that all started in the 1980s when HIV and AIDS became a huge epidemic for the gay community. Uh, we've had to look at so many political repression from that, and the idea of gay people being irresponsible, and because we're not following this traditional idea of what sex is, it has become something that's so extremely stigmatized and something that you're not able to necessarily freely represent. When we look at his narrative about, picking up guys and his, escapades in prostitution all across the world, we also have to look at, well, what would his experience have been if he was straight? We have all of these different stories of prostitutes, female prostitutes, being paired with, male clients. But it's not something that's ever as stigmatized as, say, Chris Bell's experience. Well, his friend, even in the article, said, you probably don't want to be doing things like that and picking up random people. He said it was almost as if he was explaining it as a fetish, which we also have to look at as a huge stigma. But we'll come back to that. We look at Chris Bell and his risky behavior, and what exactly is risky behavior? He didn't know the guys that he was sleeping with necessarily, but the thing is, you can get HIV from anybody. And it's not something that, you can put yourself more at risk for. I mean, yes, you don't necessarily want to pick up a dirty needle off of the road and just jab it in and hope for the best. At least I would hope that no one would want to do that. But everyone is at risk if you are going to be engaging in sexual activity. But what I want to make very clear is that is not me saying that sex is something that should be feared. In fact, it's something that should be more and more educated about. I guess that's not really a sentence, but we'll pretend it is. And it's this idea of repression. Repression, to me, kind of translates to risk. If you are saying to your child, do not have sex, you will get pregnant and die, that's not going to help them. In fact, what it's going to do, based off of what I've read in quotes, I mean, I know that at the beginning of Chris Bell's article, he says, let's go ahead and check it out. I want to make sure that I quote this correctly. The cost of safety is to deny bodily pleasure. That's so incredibly powerful and important because it recognizes this idea of sex being very important. Sex is something that's inherently biological, and most people, and by most people I mean the majority, I'm not discounting anyone who is asexual, but it is something that is socialized as an importance in our society. Kind of looking more at this idea of risk and repression, I pose this question to everyone. Are people more likely to be promiscuous as a result of denying freedom? I don't know. I mean, I think that, when you grow up in a very conservative environment, the idea of, taking a bite of the forbidden fruit becomes a little bit more enticing. But, I mean, it's one of those things, I think, that when it comes to personalized experiences, you can't necessarily make one sweeping generalization. And so when it comes to how things are, when it comes to, sex in general, we have to look at what it is that makes it proper. Now, I think that it's very interesting when you look at the shift in how people view homosexuality, as we are talking about this idea of improper versus proper. We now have the right to marry throughout the United States, as well as many other great progressive countries. Sorry, my own personal bias. But now we look at, okay, well, monogamy is the proper way to experience sex. But again, where is this idea of proper versus improper? If it's not biblical, what exactly is it? Because, I mean, if you really look at it, and I guess I'm just cynical in this sense, but men cannot reproduce with other men. I mean, it just doesn't work in that biological sense. Of course, there's surrogacy and all of those advanced scientific measures, but there's no there's no conception of birth. There's no conception of life. So then how does that translate to the heterosexual community? I know, of course, we've had this hot topic of Planned Parenthood as recent, um, and this idea of, why should the government be paying for women to be promiscuous and all of this stuff. Well, I think that that's a very, very interesting concept because it kind of brings the same idea of homosexual sexual acts. I mean, there's no there's no want for conception. So is it that we are so set in our ways as products of biblical proportions, as this is how our country was kind of founded? I mean, I know that we have so many progressive people who don't necessarily rely on their Bible as their only source, but I'm sure that at some point, in most American lineage, they're able to find some sort of biblical element because most people who immigrated to this country had that sort of biblical influence and those values and traditions. So I think that that might be a huge reason why the stigma exists when it comes to gay sex, and it has to do with what we deem to be proper. I did say that I wanted to go into fetishes, and I do want to talk on that a little bit, just because I find that to be so interesting, especially correlating with this class and the idea of policing your body. When it comes to finding pleasure, who are we to say what you should and should not find pleasure from? I know that for myself, I would consider myself pretty vanilla when it comes to my sexual exploits, but there are plenty of people that find pleasure in alternative forms of sexual acts. And why is it that they're the ones that are stigmatized? Are we not all guilty of the same sin? Is there any real degree of sin? And can there really be one worse act than another? I mean, I think that it goes back into this idea of how society structures it. I know many people that are in polyamorous relationships. I know people who are in open relationships. I know people who identify as furries, which is more of a personality trait rather than a sexual fetish, but it can definitely correlate and intersect. So the thing is, I mean, there are so many people that look down on people with these abnormal fetishes. But unless you are, in my opinion, unless you are engaging in sexual activity the way it is constructed in a manual, Bible, whatever have you, you're not able to really argue that there's one specific way to have sex, one specific proper way. And so I kind of leave that with my rant on how sex is sort of formed. I think that it'd be very interesting to talk to other people who are very sex positive, like I am, about this particular subject matter. But kind of in conclusion, what I'd like to leave everyone with is this idea that stigmatizing really anything that's not your own personal experience is extremely risky. It leads to a lot of very unsafe behaviors, and it doesn't do any good for those who are taking that advice. So I say, as I've always said, as a very liberal person, do what you want to do, essentially. And as long as everything is consensual, have fun and blog about it.